Thank you. And that slide is intentionally black, but it should change in a moment. So my name is David Barron. I'm a longtime eclipse chaser, and I'm a science writer. These days I write books, most importantly this one called American Eclipse, which tells the true story of a total solar eclipse that crossed the American West in 1878, including Texas. And I'll talk about that briefly tomorrow. But during most of my career, for almost 30 years, I was a journalist. I worked in public radio. And way back in the 1990s, I was a science correspondent for NPR. And in that job, I frequently reported on astronomy, including solar eclipses. This is a link to a piece of mine from Morning Edition the day before a total solar eclipse in 1999. Now, it's safe to say that the day before an eclipse, say on April 7th of next year, there'll be no difficulty getting newspapers, TV stations, and radio to cover the event. But that's still 6 months away. Now, between now and then, we have a lot to do to educate and inform the public, to make sure that everyone is ready. And you'd hope that the news media would spontaneously take up this task. After all, isn't public education just another term for news? Well, the answer is no. Sure, educating the public is part of what news organizations do, and there will be some stories that give straightforward information. In fact, we're already seeing many stories like this, but there are only so many times that a news organization can run the basics. A newspaper is not a textbook. It's not an almanac. If we're going to keep the eclipse front and center in the public's mind for the next 6 months, we have to be more creative about encouraging media coverage. And that means offering reporters and editors information in a newsy form. So what does that mean? Well, in my brief remarks here, I'll go over some of the key traits that journalists are looking for in stories, and I'll illustrate them by showing some actual stories from 2017 between February and July. So from 6 months to 3 weeks before the total eclipse that year. Well, perhaps the most obvious trait of news is that it focuses on what's new, what's happening now, not what's happening half a year from now. Remember, you're competing with everything else that's going on, a possible government shutdown or the latest heat wave. So when you talk to a reporter and you say, I'd suggest you write a story about the eclipse that's going to happen in April, they'll almost always say, okay, I'll do that in April or maybe in March. Well, one way around that is to provide what journalists call a news peg, a reason to do the story now. Now, that might be an event that you're holding now, say a planetarium program about the eclipse that you've just launched. That's news because it's happening now. That's a story that a local paper in Pennsylvania ran 4 months before the total eclipse in 2017. What else might you do now to bring the news media's coverage to the eclipse? A business in the path of totality in 2017 sponsored an eclipse-related art contest. That brought attention to itself and to the eclipse 5 months before the moon's shadow arrived. A more practical sort of thing, Lipscomb University in Tennessee held an education summit in the summer of 2017 and made the eclipse its theme. That drew press attention. Indeed, this very workshop would make an excellent subject for a news item, especially in the San Antonio papers. It's happening now, and it possesses another favorable trait for the news media. Local news outlets, of course, prefer local stories. 6 months before the total eclipse in 2017, the paper in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, reported on how local officials were preparing. That's always a good angle, finding a way to localize a national story. The paper in Greenwood, South Carolina, took a similar approach. It examined how the local university was preparing for the eclipse. Preparations, that's news. What challenges are people facing now to get ready for next April? Another important point, you may think of the eclipse as a science story, but what most interests news editors are stories about people. So how can you humanize a story about the sun and the moon? Well, offer unusual, passionate people for journalists to talk to and profile. And eclipse chasers tend to be just that, good characters. A South Carolina paper profiled a man who saw his first total eclipse in 1970 and was inspired to become an astronomy professor. The University of Virginia's paper ran a similar profile of one of its professors and used that as a way to alert the public that the eclipse was coming. Profiles of scientists who plan to study the upcoming eclipse are also popular stories, especially when they're citizen scientists, and even more so when they're kids. Everyone likes stories of kids and pictures of kids. And that's another enticement to a reporter, good images. Now, obviously, this doesn't apply to radio, but for TV and newspapers, compelling visuals help sell a story. Okay, one more key trait to think about when pitching a story, and that's the element of surprise. A topic is newsier the more unexpected it is. That's the cliched idea that dog bites man is not a story. Man bites dog, that's a story. So try to pitch stories with an element of the unusual. Maybe it's a new musical composition about the eclipse that was a good story in Chicago in July of 2017. And if you'll allow me a brief tangent, I hope there will be a similar good story here in Texas because my book has been turned into a musical. There's talk of a performance being staged in Waco in early April, so stay tuned. All right, one final example. What if you found a story that combined all the traits I talked about? What would it look like? Well, it might be something like this. Employees of a local company had just produced the world's largest pair of solar eclipse glasses. Sure, this was a gimmick, but it was new, local, human, visual, and certainly surprising. And that made it a story that was too enticing for the Memphis paper to ignore fully 6 months before the eclipse. So I'm happy to talk more about this during the question and answer, and I'll be at the pitch session, I think, this afternoon as well. So thank you.